Right, wait a second until we see people joining. We won't see people join. Good. I see. I thought it's everybody. It's one of those webinars. There we are. Right. Good morning, everybody. Never work with children or technology, as a wise person once said. Great to welcome you all this morning to the Campaign for Better Transport Virtual Research Symposium. My name is Michael Solomon Williams. I'm Head of Campaigns at Campaign for Better Transport, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this morning to this fantastic, very exciting session indeed. We are very, very lucky that we have an archivist, the fantastic Kate Buchbaum, working at the National Railway Museum on our archives. We have 52 years of history of the Campaign for Better Transport in its previous incarnation, of course, Transport 2000. That archive is an extraordinary treasure trove of printed materials, audiovisual materials, and much, much more, which Kate has been working through brilliantly. Before we get into this meeting, I would urge you all, in the strongest possible terms, to watch the video which the National Railway Museum and Kate have put together. It's an absolutely stunning video on their Off the Rails series about the archive. It's a brilliant insight, 15 minutes of your time, very well spent, and it gives you just a taster of some of the things that we've done over the years. It includes, indeed, very fantastic archive coverage of the jazz funeral, the New Orleans funeral put together for the death of Railtrack, as it were. Indeed, the Sardine Man escapade with Stephen Joseph and Sardine Man, and also on top of that, the wonderful Mystic Peg. I'll leave it to you to find out who Mystic Peg was and if she might ever reappear one day. So we have a superb session for you today where we're going to be exploring some of that history. We'll be hearing from Stephen Joseph, the long-standing Chief Executive of Campaign for Better Transport and Transport 2000. He's been our longest-standing Chief Exec. He led us for 28 years. And he'll be having a chat with the fantastic and inspirational Jonathan Bray about those days, historical perspectives of campaigning. Before that, we'll be hearing about the archive from Kate Buchbaum and Rob Scargill, the lead curator of the Futures Gallery at the National Railway Museum. Then after the fireside chat with Stephen and Jonathan, we'll be hearing from our very own Sylvia Barrett, our Director of Campaigns and Research at Campaign for Better Transport. She'll be talking about some of the things that we are advocating for today, the landscape in 2025 of transport campaigning. Thereafter, we'll be hearing from a fantastic trio of campaigners who work for other organisations, but 2 out of 3 of them have actually worked for us. That's Chris Todd from Transport Action Network, Kat Hobbs from We Own It, and Stephen Frost from the IPPR. They will be doing some presentations and talking about some of the campaigns that they are working on at the moment. And finally, we'll then be hearing from you. There's a good long session at the end of this symposium where you all will have the chance to ask your questions of our fantastic collected panelists and presenters. So without further ado, we begin our session today with Learnings from the Past, the Campaign for Better Transport archive, with our speakers Rob Scargill and Kate Buchbaum.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just share my screen. Perfect. So, yes, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name's Rob Scargill. I am the lead curator of the Railway Futures Gallery at the National Railway Museum, a project I'll tell you more about later on. And before I hand over to Kate, who, as Michael said, has done an unbelievable job in cataloguing this archive, I want to share just a little bit of context as to why we at the museum are so excited to be able to unearth this material. This on screen now is an engraving currently on display in the Science Museum in London, which is one of our 5 museum sites at the Science Museum Group. It depicts a fantasy invasion of England by a French army using a concept for the Channel Tunnel. It dates back to 1798, the same year Napoleon invaded Egypt. The Channel Tunnel, of course, didn't open until 1994, nearly 200 years after this artwork was created, but the Channel Tunnel was an idea that had long been in people's minds. In 1872, the Channel Tunnel Company was established in London. This is an original seal die used by the company to stamp official documents. In 1880, trial borings began at Abbott's Cliff near Dover, and by 1883, 3.5 kilometres had been tunnelled. So why didn't we have a Channel Tunnel in the 19th century? You would assume that it was because of engineering limitations, but no, it was because of politics. public opinion had shifted from broadly supportive of the project to strongly against it as a result of campaigns by key political figures citing fear of invasion and war. And why do I bring this up? To make the point that railways and politics are inextricably linked and always have been, and that to shy away from politics' influence on the railways would be just as silly as if we shied away from the impact of steam engines. The museum has always collected objects and archival material that demonstrate the cultural and social impact of railway developments and its context in wider transport debate. The problem, though, is that these are very short-lived by their very nature, and many important political records were simply discarded when the issue being discussed was abandoned. Only the voices of the famous and influential survive from the debates over railway building at the time of railway mania in the 1830s, 40s and 50s, for example. And here you can see a petition from Oxford University against the construction of a railway line that was eventually built 6 years after this was published. In the present day, we undertake collecting at the museum to ensure that these 19th century gaps in the collection are not repeated into the 21st century. Debates are complex and divisive, and it is essential that their depth is captured in all its detail. For example, this banner was kindly donated by the RMT, but it represents not only the voice of a trade union, but that of 1,000 people that responded to 2023's ticket office closure public consultation. It's also a very exciting time for the museum, which is undergoing a multi-million-pound transformation at the moment to tell the story of the past, present and future of our railways. The mock-up you can see on screen is for a new visitor space, which is due to start construction very shortly. We're very excited because the road that this will appear on has just closed, meaning that we can start construction. And connected to this will be a brand new gallery dedicated to the future of our railways. You can see all 886 square meters of it from this. Great about a gallery dedicated to the future is that it can do something our historic exhibitions never could. The past is concrete, it's already happened. We know the context in which the objects that we have exist, and we know the impacts that they had on people's lives. The future, though, is up for grabs, and it's limitless in its potential, and it's something for us to create in the here and now. So what we're going to do then with this gallery is we're going to encourage our visitors to take action in the present to get to futures that they really care about. No opinion is right or wrong. We simply exist as a gallery to motivate and constantly ask questions like this. So visitors may consider what it is that they wish to see in 10, 20, 50, or even 200 years down the line. We don't have a time machine, and we simply can't exhibit objects of the future. You know, even if something exists as an idea for the future, it's of the present. So instead, what we're going to do is exhibit catalysts for change. So innovations, strategies, ideas, proposals, new technologies that exist in the here and now, designed to solve contemporary challenges that may lead to futures that visitors really care about. For example, a visitor that may not necessarily be interested in railways, they may care about the rising cost of heating their home, and maybe they want a future where they don't have to worry about providing basic necessities for themselves and their family. We can show them a scheme from Transport for London that uses waste heat from the London Underground to power nearly 15 homes in Islington. Or it may be that someone wants a future where women can travel safely at night without fear of harassment or gender-based violence. We can show them the city of Vienna, which uses sex disaggregated data to influence its design of public spaces, including railway stations and train services late at night. Or it may be that a visitor wants the freedom to travel the country without financial burden, or is worried about air pollution, or simply wants a comfortable commute. We can show the passionate examples of creative protest and lobbying from the Campaign for Better Transport archive. Rather than telling visitors what the future will look like, which we'd fail if we tried anyway, we're encouraging them to imagine it for themselves. And we're also not saying that any particular idea on gallery is right. We're simply exhibiting contemporary solutions to challenges and asking our visitors what they think about them. Could they do better? Is the exhibited item the right way to solve the challenge? Is it even the right challenge we should be solving? And most importantly, will it move us to the futures that we want to see? The big idea, in short, is that we will not attempt to predict the future, but we'll encourage visitors to imagine it and empower them to create it. And we will use parts of this fantastic archive, obviously, to do so. So I'll hand over to Kate now to explain their brilliant work. But in summary, the railways have always been and continue to be political. It's essential that we capture diverse political voices at times of live debate so that that material is preserved for the future. And excitingly, we plan to use the Campaign for Better Transport archive, which is obviously full of this kind of material, to do something very different for a museum, especially a science and engineering led museum, to empower our visitors to take action in the present to build the futures that they wish to see. So, with all that being said, I will now hand over to Kate.
Hello, thank you very much for joining today. My name is Kate Buckbaum. I'm an archive cataloguer at the National Railway Museum, and I've had the distinct privilege over the last better part of this year to catalogue the Campaign for Better Transport collection. As Rob has been talking about, things we're doing to manage and develop a future that we want to see. It's also helpful to kind of look sort of historically at different approaches to shaping that future. And so that's been the sort of main crux of this project to catalog the Campaign for Better Transport archive. So today I would like to take you through some of those learnings and show you what sort of knowledge we can gain from looking sort of at the past. So just to give you a brief overview of the project. So it's called Unlocking the Campaign for Better Transport Archive. It's a 6-month fixed-term project which has been funded very generously by the Foundation for Integrated Transport in memory of Dr. Simon Norton, who was not only a mathematician but an avid transport campaigner. And the project has aimed to kind of open up the archive and tell the story of those 52 years into the present as a sort of living organization, to catalog the archive, repackage it, ensure that it's in the sort of materials that will enable it to be available for many generations, to digitize certain materials, a selection of these from the collection, and then to promote it in different channels, both digitally and in person, engaging different audiences and encouraging research into the archives. As an organization that's still active today, it's important to kind of understand the collaborative aspect of it. As you have heard, there are quite a few here who have been involved over the years, and that's something that we've also discovered as we have begun to process the archive. So in the initial stage of transfer, there were 40 boxes, which have since elapsed into 135 boxes, including all sorts of different materials, many of which are seen in and stored in folders like these. As you can see from some of the folders, they include many different samples of handwriting, so there were quite a few different people involved in the project, not only to sort of preserve the history, but to make sure it was safe for transfer. You'll see kind of some of the initial materials that are in the campaign, including sort of the sort of bound books, everything to plastic, spiral bound materials, printer paper, photographs, all sorts of different types of materials. And the sort of main job of processing is to understand the context of those materials, and to understand how they fit within an archive. So through that processing, we have also begun to decant those materials and put them into archival grade conservation materials. As you can see here, we've been working both with volunteers as well as members of our internal curatorial team to work on this project. So as you see on the left-hand side, there are many 35mm slides that we've been looking through and exploring everything from sort of traffic reduction campaigns to public transport samples in other countries across Europe, as well as closer within the UK. We've also been working, as you can see on the right-hand side, sort of repackaging these materials in acid-free folders to make sure that they are sort of reducing the risks and hazards that may otherwise limit their impact in the longer term. We have also been working a lot with the discovery of the materials and kind of exploring the stories that have come out of this collection. So as you can see, there's been quite a lot of variety in the types of materials produced. So as you can see on the left, there's everything from the sort of initial foundation of the organization through the press releases that announced the launch of Transport 2000, which was the original name of Campaign for Better Transport. You'll see the agenda of the conference during which the organization was launched, and you'll see some of the sort of initial publications that illustrate the sort of main original priorities of the organization, including drawing attention to electrification and the activities of British Rail, everything to moving into sort of what national transport guidelines could look like and what it could look like to dream futures for Scotland, for example. But then moving into more recent work, sort of reclaiming street space and working through sort of good practices for people's leisure time as well, enabling systems where people don't have to rely on cars necessarily to enjoy tourism and different areas of the country. We have also found evidence of some of the different campaigns leveraging sort of public demonstration as a strategy for affecting change. So here you'll see two sort of examples of the types of materials we found, including sort of demonstration placards from the Fair Fares Now campaign, which was in the early 2010s, as well as the sort of lollipop sticks, which you'll see on the right-hand side, illustrating some of the methods to save buses amid deregulation and to draw attention to sort of roads and the sort of environmental and social impact of those. We've also unfolded and discovered individual sort of maybe playful or lighthearted campaigns. So this one is around Sardine Man. I speak about this more in the YouTube video that Michael mentioned, but it is sort of going into the early 2000s, 2007, and looking at overcrowding and the sort of lack of investment in rail at the time. So this example is of a campaign in which someone in a sardine costume would ride 10 routes in the UK and England and Wales. And we have a kind of mock-up of that initial design of the costume, which was handmade, and as well as some of the press coverage that it got. So this is an example of Sardine Man in the world, as you might say. We also have more examples of this. So thinking about Mystic Peg, which is another one that Michael mentioned at the beginning of this seminar. We have a sort of example of rail fare costs around the same time, 2007, thinking about the difference between advanced fares and single sort of walk-on fares at the time was up to 5 times the amount of an advanced fare. So thinking about creative ways to get people involved and to integrate sort of passenger interests into their sort of everyday commutes. So this one, for example, is at Liverpool Street Station in London. On the right, you'll also see an example that was around buses. So not only rail was the focus of many of these campaigns, there was also sort of social issues such as accessibility and what it looks like for passengers of buses who are wheelchair users to access public transport and to feel sort of accounted for in those experiences. And so this is an image, it's the only image, and to my knowledge, one of the only bits of documentation of this protest. So it is interesting as well to kind of understand how things get interpreted and how they sort of trickle down into an archive, and that it might be just one picture that can tell a story that is worth sort of returning to and learning from again and again, as well as sort of individual discovery in the archive and in the stores. We've also gotten out to speak to people and engage them in different conversations about the archive. So we were fortunate enough to attend the Better Transport Week conference, which was arranged by the Campaign for Better Transport this year, where we had a stall and sort of invited people attending the conference to look at some of the materials from the collection and reproduction. So on the left, you'll see some of the examples that we selected. We also invited attendees to sort of collaborate and build on the things they'd learned through those materials. So we have some examples of a craftivist campaign that was then reproduced during the conference to leverage the different statistics that are relevant to the Campaign for Better Transport today. So really kind of building on the knowledge and the decades of experience that the Campaign for Better Transport has, and then sort of exploring that in further detail. There have also been events on site. So we had an open day last month in which members of the Campaign for Better Transport, past and present, as well as future, came to the National Railway Museum to explore the archive and add sort of depth to some of the stories that we had pulled through the archival materials. So you'll see some footage from the press testing for the launch of Sardine Man in 2007, which is what you'll see on the right-hand side. And then you'll also kind of see the sort of the stories that kind of open up through through bringing people in closer contact with the archive and enabling them to really look at things and flip through them and see kind of what stories have come out of it. We have also done digital engagement, which is something that Michael mentioned as well at the beginning of this. So I would encourage you to maybe look at this if you're interested, to kind of explore some of the campaigns in more detail. And this is just one way in which we've been engaging with different communities in a digital format. In terms of what we wish for people to achieve in looking at this archive in particular is to sort of bring visibility to the different types of activities that a transport campaign is working around. So it's not just lobbying, it's sort of getting into the streets, it's getting people engaged. It's introducing them to the sort of realities of transport campaigning. In the archive itself, you'll see a lot of examples of sort of printer paper where there's a report on the back of an invitation to a launch event for the Growing the Railways campaign, for example. So you'll see this kind of reuse and recycling of materials that maybe illustrates the access to resources, for example. You'll also see kind of letters from different people that have maybe manuscript notes on them saying "for your attention" or "please read this," or just kind of illustrating the different hands that an activity passed through and how it sort of got communicated within the organization. Through these acts, they become signals that campaigns can be included in archives, that they are sort of essential part of history to sort of understand where we've been and where we're going as well. And that sort of archives are for everyone because they do tell our stories and they tell the sort of stories of our own experiences. So, so as I mentioned before, with themes of sort of overcrowding and rail fare prices, these are issues that are still things that we think about today in our everyday lives, in our commutes, in our visits to family. So, so in documenting this history and in preserving it, we're enabling people to interact with things that they are already interacting with, but maybe adding a different context or a different strategy to understand how to approach that kind of in real time. And then through this this act, we're also preserving the legacy of transport campaigning, so that future generations can be aware of kind of what strategies have been used in the past, what was successful, how to sort of build on these things, and that the archive, in enabling research into it, we're creating an opportunity to build tools for change. So all of these things are kind of achievable, and researching into the archive becomes an opportunity for people to learn about what they might do in the future and how they might build that future around sort of communal needs and collective needs. So just to say that in the process of working through this archive, we are creating a catalog, which will be available some point this summer. So we will be making that available. An initial format is already available on the website. So you'll be able to see kind of broad strokes now, much more detail later of what is contained in the archive, and maybe plan a research trip as well. We'll make available some of the materials digitally, which you can see in this image. So we really encourage people to engage with it and to explore that history. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. We'll see you there.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Rob. Absolutely fantastic. And I hope that's given you all a really, really great insight into the extraordinary work that's being done by Kate and the team at the NRM. We are hugely excited and hugely grateful to you and to the Foundation for Integrated Transport, and just thrilled that we're going to be part of the Futures Gallery. And I love the way that you frame it, Rob, in terms of the inspiration that our work can give to future generations about how to address the challenges that we face today. So next, it's a great privilege to introduce our next two speakers, both of whom are, it's fair to say, veterans, if you appreciate that term in the right sense, vintage veterans and legends in their own right, both still extremely active in the space. Stephen Joseph, many on this call will know, but for those who don't, Stephen Joseph was our chief executive from 1988 until 2018. So a really significant stint of time in charge of this organisation. He's been the longest standing chief exec, and for many people, our work is still very much associated with the impact of Stephen over that period of time. And we're delighted that Stephen has now, in his role with the Foundation for Integrated Transport, helped ensure that our legacy will last for the long, long term. And he remains very supportive of our work in the present day. The other fireside chatter on this session is the brilliant Jonathan Bray. Now, Jonathan was involved with Transport 2000 as director of the platform programme, as well as being involved over the period of time that Stephen was chief exec with Alarm, the anti-roads protesting and campaigning with Alarm, Save Our Railways campaign also before joining Transport 2000, and then for a long stint from 2008 till just a couple of years ago was director of the Urban Transport Group, supporting mayoral and combined authorities. Both absolutely inspirational characters, and I'm delighted that they're now going to have a fireside chat. So I don't know if we have an appropriate fireside somewhere for them to chat around, but you get the idea. It's going to be a relatively informal catch-up between Jonathan and Stephen on historical perspectives of campaigning and their reflections on things they did together and how they see that relate to what we're doing these days. Over to you, chaps.
Great, thank you very much, and hello everybody. I think it's really important that this kind of archive material has been kept. I mean, my experience of archives and organisations is sometimes people come in, new person comes in and says, "Well, what's all this old junk? You know, we're starting afresh. Let's get it all skipped." And I think that's something the NRM have come across in other parts of the railway jungle. So we owe Stephen a big debt of gratitude for ensuring that this archive did survive. And also, we owe Stephen a debt of gratitude for ensuring that when he was at Transport 2000, he made it a place that spawned and nurtured and supported other campaigns. There was no preciousness there. And I was involved in some of those campaigns like Save Our Railways on rail privatisation and Alarm UK on roads. So this archive also contains materials from those other related campaigns. They've also been preserved. I think it's important as well because campaign perspectives can easily be written out of the official histories. If you look at Christian Woolmar's book on rail privatisation, I think Save Our Railways is mentioned once. And also we're talking about a pre-internet era. So on some of these campaigns, it's hard for me to believe it, never mind probably some people listening, but you could spend all afternoon by the fax machine faxing out press releases. We also used to send press releases out by post, kind of rushing down to the post office at Vauxhall to catch the last post. And everyone was on the phone all day. That was the only way you could organise anything or get things done. Unlike now, where everything's on the internet, everything's kind of instantly archived. This is a paper era. And once that paper is lost, if it's lost, it's gone forever. And that record is gone. And the role of campaigns in changing transport policy is gone. So that's a few intro remarks. Stephen, do you want to tell us a bit about the story of this archive?
Yes, thanks very much, Jonathan. I'm very pleased to be on this event. I think it's great that this archive is being celebrated. Yes, so the backstory is that I mean, originally I did a history degree, so I was rather keen to make sure that this stuff survived. And when the Campaign for Better Transport was moving offices to an office which wouldn't be able to store all this, I was very keen that that it was saved and made publicly available. And I'm very grateful to the Science Museum Group and the NRM for taking it on. I'm not entirely sure quite what they realized they were getting. But I think there's some very important stuff in here. That the example I'd give that's really stark, which you were deeply involved in, Jonathan, at Save Our Railways. Why are there still sleepers between London and Scotland? Well, actually, there weren't going to be after privatisation. There was an attempt to write them out of the picture. Save Our Railways, Transport 2000 and others took the government to court to keep the sleepers in being and won. And that's why there are still sleepers going to Scotland. And if you hadn't got that archive, that material in the archive, all the legal papers on that, you wouldn't know why there were Scottish sleepers. So I think that's an immediate example of why this archive is so important in terms of showing why we've got the railway we've got now, and as Rob has said, what the future might look like. So that's just one example of an immediate reason why this archive supports what the NRM and the wider Science Museum Group are doing in terms of telling the story of railways and transport.
Thanks, Stephen. I mean, I think a number of themes come out from this archive. It obviously covers a long period and a lot of different activities, but I think one of the themes is the ongoing fight against roads as the dominant theme of transport policy. I think at the start of the story of Transport 2000, it was very much trying to get the emphasis to move away from roads and just seeing public transport as a kind of residual service that reluctantly had to be kept going. And I think it's also a story of the success of that, because clearly road building isn't dead. It is staggering on in a zombie kind of way. But I do think the campaigning over this period has achieved three things on road building. Firstly, urban road building is pretty much dead. If you look at the 1990s and the what we call London assessment studies, where there were plans to widen some of the arterial roads into London and also build an inner ring road for London, which was defeated. That kind of stuff, I don't think it is coming back. I think the other thing that's happened with road building is there's not the same systematic approach to increasing road capacity that there was in, say, the 1990s when we had the Roads to Prosperity Road Programme, which was about, it actually was a coherent plan in its own terms. It was about a systematic increase in capacity on key corridors, and no matter what or where the impact. So that's why you got things like Twyford Down. It was in the way of this strategic plan. I think now road building is much more ad hoc, and it's justified by factors to do with individual schemes than that kind of systematic plan. And I think the other thing that was achieved is we no longer have a roads first and reluctant support for public transport as a secondary thing. I mean, again, if you look back to the 80s and 90s when I first started getting involved in campaigning, hard to believe, but Transport for London, as it was then, was slating certain tube stations for closure. We had very run-down public transport. We had the King's Cross fire, where old wooden escalators hadn't been cleaned out properly of oil and what have you, and that caught fire, leading to the disaster. We had the Serpil report proposing a whole new wave of closures, a kind of beaching redux. And all of those things are not really conceivable anymore. And if you look at the last Conservative government, who, you know, they were the government at that time who were doing government during some of those things I talked about. The last Conservative government, HS2, line reopening fund, bus back better, really hard to imagine that if you go back in time. I think another key theme that comes through is the reversal of Thatcher's deregulation and privatisation programme of public transport that happened in the 80s and 90s. It's taken a long time, but we now have rail nationalisation coming back. We've also got buses coming back under public control, and we've seen the fantastic success of that in Manchester. And again, that's something that CBT, Transport 2000 is involved in. And one last theme I wanted to bring out. Now, I think there's a kind of underlying thing in transport campaigning around fairness and dignity and safety. So from Rosa Parks in the 1960s on desegregating buses in America to the 1970s campaign in the Netherlands around a refusal to accept the level of child casualties that came, and it comes every country where you move to mass motorisation, and that shifted Dutch transport policy to what we see on the streets now in terms of provision for active travel. Or if you look in the UK on the direct action campaigns on accessibility for disabled people, or you look at the Fares Fair campaign in London in the 1980s, all those were around these themes of fairness, dignity and safety. And I think that also comes through from these archives. But Stephen, what do you think the value of the archive is to the present day campaigns that are going on?
Well, I think the first point to make is that the archive as a whole tells people that actually you can do something about transport, that you can influence transport policy. The things you've mentioned, the big changes away from urban road building and the reversal of bus deregulation and rail privatisation, and all the things around that, the reopening of railway lines that were declared dead in the beaching era, that all of those are the results of people getting involved and making the argument in favour of having better public transport locally. So I think it's the archive is an inspiration to people, alongside and to do it in a way that is eye-catching and fun, like Sardine Man. I also remember at some point having a tea party in the middle of a roundabout in the west of England to highlight road building schemes that are still sort of wandering around the place. But so we did eye-catching things that really made a difference in terms of how people and it's worth saying, by the way, that Transport 2000's name, as Kate has pointed out in the very good YouTube piece she's done, came from York 2000, which was resisting a proposal to essentially run an inner ring road round the medieval walls of the city in the early 1970s. And as you've said, that kind of stuff has died, and I don't think it's coming back. So you could see real change here, and we can learn from mistakes and successes. We can, and we're now seeing a lot of new transport campaigning. You'll hear from some of that later about what's still going on. And the Foundation for Integrated Transport, which I'm trustee and chair of, is funding a number of these campaigns to make them
Stephen, I think you've actually just muted yourself, perhaps. I don't know if there's a setting on your microphone that you may have touched. I had a little oh, there, that sounds like
good. Sorry,
you're back, no problem. Just
don't know
the
what happened there.
last sentence of that we missed, I think.
Okay. The Foundation for Integrated Transport was set up by Simon Norton, who was for many years ran the Cambridge and West Suffolk Transport 2000 local group, and was deeply involved in local and to an extent national campaigning himself. So he was really instrumental in this, and I think he would be very keen to see the message of campaigning continuing. So those, I think that's the message that the archive gives, that you can change things on transport, and there are opportunities for doing so, and doing so in an eye-catching and fun way.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to emphasize another point, which is if you look at changes in transport policy, I do believe that it's people power and campaigns that have made the difference. The kind of professional managerial class within the system often claim when there's big changes that they're always in favour of it, but most of the time they want to preserve the consensus with their colleagues and their established systems. It's the big changes and ruptures are forced from the outside through politics and through people power, and I think that's one of the stories of this archive. And I think what it also shows is there's kind of short wave and long wave change. So you've got some short term victories, say like rail track going under, and then you've got long term change, which you help contribute to the atmosphere to create. So rail privatisation coming to an end, and you can the long run of this archive, I think, helps bring out that kind of short wave and long wave, but also I know from the insider being involved in campaigns that it is flipping hard work, and most people only got one or two campaigns in them. I'm not sure I could go back to some of the stuff I did before, but I think, and there's some amazing campaigns at the moment. We're going to hear Transport Activists Network, which is doing a fantastic job. But I think sometimes it's hard work, but perhaps one of the value of this archive is it shows that over that period it is worthwhile and it does get change. I think the other thing that's happening in campaigning world, perhaps compared with our day, Stephen, is that greater diversity of people involved in campaigns, and rather than just male policy geeks like our good selves. So to give you two examples, if you look at the American campaigns that are going on around anti-roads campaigning at the moment, they're very much driven by social justice, because these big motorways were driven through poorer, more ethnically diverse areas. And there's a sense there that this isn't just a transport thing. This is about social justice, about restoring more diverse communities and putting right some of the wrongs of the past. And if you look at someone like Ellie Harrison, who I would say is probably the most influential person on Scottish transport policy at the moment, and she is a conceptual artist. She's not a transport person. So she brings in creativity and imagination to it, which I think has been very effective. I know it's not rail, but it would be, it would be good for the archive. Actually, I think she's looking for somewhere to house it. But she was behind the bus deregulation, the musical, so
Yes.
on roller skates, which various roller skating people had capes denoting various bus companies. Not when I saw that, I thought, yeah, we're definitely going to win. And there's no way the opposition are going to come up with anything like this. I think that campaigning is becoming more diverse, and I think that that is good. And yeah, it'd be great if we could get the capes into the Railway Museum, though it is buses, I have to admit.
Yes, and unfortunately, I'm afraid we discovered that the Sardine Man costume was thrown out in one of the T2000 CBT office moves. Unfortunately, we could otherwise we could have had that. Yes, I wanted to pay tribute actually to what the work that we'll hear about from Cat Hobbs and We Own It later. When they did the Better Buses for Greater Manchester campaign, they didn't just talk to people who were existing bus users or people interested in buses. They went out into communities and said, what kind of bus service do you want? Why aren't you using buses? And the answer was, well, the current system doesn't work for us. It's the fares are too high or too disaggregated, and there aren't enough services at the times we want to use it. So I think that kind of engagement, Citizens UK doing some work at the moment, all of those campaigns have kind of, as you've said, made transport part of an argument about fairness and dignity and safety. And I think all of, and certainly some of the anti-road campaigns here have mirrored, as you've said, what's been going on in the States about the impact that road building would have on communities and devising them. So that's very much that kind of wider issue. And we'll hear from Stephen Frost about the work that IPPR have been doing. They've just published a report on that, which the foundation part funded. So as you said, Jonathan, the campaigning has definitely become a lot more diverse. New groups like Transport for All have been really making the argument about disabled access and not taking the current system as read. They managed to get at least some accessibility improvements to the Elizabeth line, for instance. Those kinds of campaigns and campaigners are really making a difference now.
Yeah, and I think what the archive also shows is that the importance of that kind of web of contacts and networking between campaigns, and that key role that Transport 2000 played in supporting and helping establish some of these sub-campaigns. It is really hard running these campaigns. It's exhausting, and you're always fighting against organizations which have got far, far greater resources than you have. So having that kind of mutual support and that wider web and network, I think is really valuable. And I hope that does come out from the archive. And I think it's something that needs to continue in the future. I think some campaigns are very much focused on their own brand and linking it to fundraising, and everything has to be done within their corporate ID. That's not my kind of campaigning. I don't think it's Stephen's kind of campaigning. I don't think it's the most effective kind of campaigning. It's being part of that wider network. And as I say, Stephen deserves a great deal of credit for that. I just don't think some of these campaigns would have been as effective and as successful as they had been without being part of that wider web and network.
I think that's right. I think what the campaign Transport 2000 have tried to do over the years is to enable others to do things, to support other campaigns. We were very helpful to Alarm UK in the early days, which is now in effect the ancestor of Transport Action Network, which we'll hear about. And we also, I think, what I tried to do was to try and make the Department for Transport see campaigners and campaigns like Transport 2000 as people they actually needed to talk to, as opposed to people they tried to distance. In the early days of Transport 2000, it was sort of avowedly set up, I think, as a sort of answer to the very well-funded British Road Federation, which, with people inside the Department for Transport, was trying to shut down all the railways and build roads everywhere. And they were inside, and Transport 2000 people were outside. That changed over time. But within the archive, for instance, is the Peeler Memorandum from the early 1980s, which was leaked to Transport 2000 and which had Department for Transport officials discussing setting up a supposedly independent inquiry on heavier lorries, which would come to a decision in line with the department's views. That got lots of media coverage. There's an inside track and outside track story in this archive, and I hope people will be able to explore that too.
Brilliant. Well, I think Michael wants to throw a bucket of water on the fire to bring our fireside chat to an end. But I think my last thought is keep the stuff, keep the records. I think for about 5 years, they're completely useless junk. And then 10, 15 years, they start to become really, really interesting. And 20, 25 years, even more interesting. So don't skip it. Ignore what your relatives say, keep it, and hopefully it can continue to be part of this story that Steve and the NRM and the Foundation for Integrated Transport have established.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Stephen, so much for those recollections and the relevance of the work that you've done over the years has to us all today and the future. And I think there's something really compelling in the inspiration that you have all given to other organisations and the support that you've given to other organisations, including some from whom we're going to hear later on today. We Own It, Transport Action Network and IPPR. And indeed, there's something very much kind of like a bit of a family reunion about today. I mean, not only your good selves, but also, I mean, Kat and Chris, who've also both worked for us. And, you know, there is this extended network of people who either at some time have worked for us or might do in future, which gives a great sense of the snowball effect of the work that T2000 and Campaign for Better Transport has created. So our next session is where we're going to hear from our Director of Policy, Sylvia Barrett. Now, she's going to give us an overview of some of the work that we are covering at the moment. And as Stephen alluded to at the end, the history of Transport 2000 and Campaign for Better Transport has been one of a sort of journey, if you like. And there is very much the sense that we are somewhat more sort of inside the DFT and the wider government tent than we were initially, perhaps, and therefore are seen as a critical friend, if you like, to government. We spend a lot of time working with and supporting government to do better, while still banging the drum if we really think they could be a bit sharper about their ideas. So we're in a very nice and interesting strategic position in the sense that, again, you alluded earlier on to Bus Back Better, we're able to feed into research that government takes on board. Governments, of course, change every few years. The civil servants who work for them change every few more years. We've been around for 52 years. I think none of them can really say that. And that consistency is recognised. So we have become the first port of call for policy advice and recommendations. And therefore, we have got ourselves into a position where we can actually make change. And it's exciting. I'll mention this a bit later, but it's exciting to be in a position where some of our recommendations are really becoming visible today. So Sylvia is going to tell us a little more about that. Over to you, Sylvia Barrett.
Thank you very much, Michael, and great to be here today. Let me just start my slides, which will take a second. And I'm hoping that this will be visible okay to everyone. Great. So thank you so much for the introduction, Michael. I guess the first thing to say here is that Campaign for Better Transport is the only charity in the transport sector that covers all transport modes, from active travel to shared mobility and their integration. So our policy landscape is vast. I was asked today to talk about the wider transport policy landscape and our current priorities. So I will talk about that. And our focus has been on public transport for a number of reasons. Once because much needs to be done on improvements of public transport, but also because other NGOs cover active travel and share mobility in a focused way. So over the next year or so, we'll be focusing on these priority areas on screen. We've got getting the best possible outcomes of rail reform for passengers and wider customers. We're focusing on championing buses and light rail and improvements on local transport options. We'll be looking at connecting communities through integrated transport and what more needs to be done in this space. And we're also looking at ensuring that the machinery of government is fit for purpose. So first of all, rail and what is happening in the rail space. Well, the short answer is plenty. There is a very significant reform process that is happening, not only with the establishment of Great British Railways, which will be a new body to bring track and train back together, but there's also a process of bringing passenger services back into state ownership. So our work in this area is focusing very much on making sure that the rail reform process is a success and that it delivers positive outcomes for passengers and for rail freight users. The picture on the right is the cover of a report which we published recently on this, and we continue engaging through the legislative process and through stakeholder and public events. I can elaborate more on that if there's questions at the end. Secondly, we focus on service and infrastructure improvements. While the recent spending review, comprehensive spending review was positive in this regard, in terms of infrastructure, many schemes are still at risk of delay or being paused. So we continue making the case for investment in infrastructure, and that includes essential maintenance to improve resilience. It includes key upgrades to improve accessibility and unlock capacity, and also campaigning for increased connectivity through growing the network, such as reopening closed lines and stations. That has been a sort of long-standing priority for us. Thirdly, fares and ticketing is a major focus for us. Passengers and the wider public tell us that affordability is a big barrier to using the railways more. And while the government is undertaking a process to simplify fares, which is very welcome, we've made recommendations in this regard as well, we are focusing on campaigning for cheaper fares too. We have published several reports on this, and we have a regular working group with decision makers to make our recommendations progress. Things like, and we have had some successes, so things like the booking window being expanded, pay as you drive being expanded to more areas as well, but we keep pushing on things like affordability. Lastly, we have been very active on international rail and expanding cross-channel travel options. Now, cross-channel international rail is privately run and outside the scope of the current domestic rail reform process. So we have been making the case for a dedicated strategy for international rail and support for new entrants to expand destinations. This has the potential to grow rail use, to bring in economic benefits, and also reduce the need for airport capacity expansion for near Europe travel. So we have seen much progress in that space, and it's still a very active area for us. So moving on to buses and local transport, much is happening on buses as well. There is a new bus services bill which will expand the ability to implement franchising and to improve the franchising process to all local transport authorities. It also has clauses about safeguarding socially necessary services, so there's much positive development in this space as well. While there are changes in how local authority funding is allocated, so we have seen a much needed move away from competitive funding allocations for local authorities towards more needs-based allocations. We argue this needs to be more targeted. So we are working on identifying and mapping gaps in provision and making recommendations for further reform in funding and provision. So this is a big work area for us over the next year. On bus fares, we have been the main proponents of the £2 bus fare cap, and we welcomed its extension, albeit at £3. But we are examining longer term the pros and cons of different fares policies in the round and the different interventions, so that we can be thinking about what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve from fare policy and how best to achieve that. On infrastructure, we promote the importance of bus priority and also the importance of improving bus infrastructure and traffic flow. But an area that we have been very active in is bus stop infrastructure. So we wrote the report, Better Bus Stops, on the right, in which we called for a categorization and a national standard for bus stop infrastructure and information provision. This is a gap that we spotted, actually a gap which was flagged to us by one of our supporters, a local campaigner, so very much in tune with our nature of sort of collaboration and local campaigning on the ground. So we have had a very important win on this with a national guidance proposed in the legislation that I mentioned, and we continue working on this at the national and the local level through a working group. And finally, trams and other forms of metros and light rail are also a very important part of local transport systems, and we have been key advocates for their expansion in our cities. So just to illustrate how much progress we have made so far, we coined the slogan "Time for Trams," as you can see on the left with this policy paper in November last year, and it more recently has been adopted by the Mayor of West Yorkshire, and you can see Tracy Brabin in this picture sporting a t-shirt with the slogan "Time for Trams." And of course, the Chancellor has been supportive of this because trams have been at the centre of the government's local investment plans announcement ahead of the spending review. So there are some very positive developments, and we'll keep working with specific cities on their promotion. So our third priority area is connected communities, and this strand of work is about the wider social and economic impacts of better transport. Our research, including on left behind communities, which is the report cover that you can see here, shows how important good public transport is to opening opportunities for people. Whereas on the other hand, if you have poor public transport provision, this further entrenches social deprivation and inequalities. So this is really a key area for us. It's what drives us to campaign for improvements. Within this space, we work very much to obviously present the evidence and making the case for improvements, but also proposing solutions for how to make everyday journeys better for everyone, how we can enable public transport connections to school, hospitals, work, shops, friends and family. So a network that can serve people's different needs. We also work to ensure that good public transport is embedded in planning policy and decision making. So for a long time, planning and transport have been disconnected with the system prioritizing out-of-town developments which are not well connected to public transport and thereby entrenching car dependence. And this is something that has had really negative impacts on those communities. So it's important to join these up. But fourthly and importantly, it's very important to celebrate good public transport where this exists and the improvements that have been delivered in recent times. And the way we do that is through our Better Transport Week initiative. So it was mentioned earlier, we launched Better Transport Week in 2023 to mark our 50th anniversary. Now it's in its third year. Well, that's just finished. It's become an annual celebration of better transport. It includes events, it includes press, case studies, competitions, and so much more as well. So if anyone watching hasn't come across Better Transport Week, I encourage you to look it up and be involved in future years. This is just a selection of photos from events that we had this year and last year. Better Transport Week has been growing every time. And this year we had 250 partner organizations involved and participating in the week, and an estimated over 1,000 individuals attending related events. It's a brilliant way to showcase what we have achieved both at the national and the local level in terms of transport improvements. Coming up to our final area of focus, this is about ensuring that both national and local government systems are able to handle the reforms that are taking place. Firstly, there is a new integrated national transport strategy currently being developed. It's the first in a generation. It's a major opportunity to ensure that different modes of transport work really well together. And obviously that's a big sort of area of focus for us, covering multimodal transport. But it is also a chance to ensure that related policy areas and government departments integrate very well together. So I already mentioned transport and planning. There's also transport and local government policy, transport and health policy, or transport and fiscal levers. So while transport is obviously the domain of the Department for Transport, there's also lots of other departments whose policies impact on making sure that transport policies work and that actual operations on the ground work for people. Another key reform that is happening at the moment is devolution. So the devolution of more powers and funding to the local level. This is crucial for delivering transport improvements because it's local authorities that tend to implement improvements on the ground. But at the same time, there is a parallel process of local government reorganization taking place. And this is the process where district councils are being abolished and forming larger unitary councils, and also the move to larger strategic authorities. So the impact that has had is that many local authorities have a long period of uncertainty ahead of them. And this is why we're looking at what government needs to do in order to ensure that local authorities have the capacity and the capability to deliver these crucial reforms. We will be doing some research. We did a similar piece of research when the national bus strategy was published to look at whether local authorities have the skills, the expertise to deliver those new requirements of them. Well, devolution coupled with integrated transport strategy will really amplify the responsibilities that will follow these newly established authorities. So this is a key area for us to look at what needs to happen and what support needs to be provided. But we also have, as an organization, we also work directly with local authorities. to provide direct support. So we provide information, we provide advice, we do best practice dissemination through case studies and toolkits. On the picture here, you can see a session that we had with one of the local authorities looking at their local transport networks and how trams can play in role in this. So we're very much embedded in sort of local processes as well as national policy influencing. So this is the end of my slides. I think this is where we are at the moment. Very much a lot of work ahead of us and our colleagues in the transport sector. And these are issues that we are working on, but our NGOs and campaigners, colleagues in other organizations are also wrestling with. So I look forward to the next discussion and to go through how that aligns with others in the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for that fantastic presentation and brilliant overview of the work that we are doing in all its forms today. And as was alluded to earlier on, the picture has changed over the 52 years that we've been around, and it's really worth remembering as we look to our next session about making public transport relevant today and in the future, at the fact that we have turned around the rail closures to rail reopenings. Stephen mentioned that earlier. We're in a year where we've been able to celebrate in Better Transport Week the Northumberland line being reopened. And there are people there living in Ashington, going down to Newcastle, whose parents, even their grandparents, had never known a railway line or a railway station. This is extraordinary stuff, it's transformational stuff, and it's a completely different world from the aftermath of Beeching and the Serpell report recommendations. We've had that line opened, we've had the Dartmoor line reopened. It's so important to recognise the positive change that's happened over this period of time. On buses, it's of course more challenging in terms of service levels, but as Jonathan said, we're at an exciting moment because of the new reorganisation of how buses are administered and the fact that we've had needs-based funding allocated for bus services recently. And then indeed, as Sylvia mentioned, our bus stop standard, which is an extraordinary success in a short space of time already. So there's great cause for optimism. Indeed, also delighted, Sylvia, that you highlighted lots of the great work that's happening on trams. The comprehensive spending review recently was a great confirmation of the faith that this government is showing in the potential of tram networks around this country. And it was great to see that picture of our work there in Hull with the local authority there. So there's lots to celebrate. But the challenges go on, and indeed, as I mentioned, we're always banging the drum and keeping government honest as much as we can. So indeed are our partner organisations and others in the sector, from whom we're now going to hear. So we have three brilliant speakers coming up. They are Chris Todd, who's the director of the Transport Action Network. As Stephen Joseph said earlier on, to an extent, I suppose, TAN are a successor of Alarm. They're also, a successor of elements of our work, and I think they keep the Overton window in the right place, if you like, and really, really hold government to account on road building in particular, as do We Own It. So Kat Hobbs, fantastic founder and director of We Own It, have a very clear focus on national ownership, and again, they keep the Overton window in the right place if we sit in somewhere else on that spectrum, if you like. And the work they do and have done in many areas is really valuable. I was really pleased also that that Jonathan made reference to Ellie Harrison's brilliant musical, the bus regulation or bus deregulation, the musical, I think, wasn't it? And those capes and the work that's done there in Edinburgh, and Ellie's work is brilliant as well. Working very closely with We Own It. And we'll then also hear from Stephen Frost, who is Principal Research Fellow and Head of Transport Policy at the IPPR. I don't know how many will have seen, but there was a fantastic report just yesterday released by the IPPR on the relationship between car ownership and poverty, and actually the sunk costs and the challenges that people who don't have access to public transport have in paying to run a car if that's the only option they have. That's linked to some of the work that we do that Sylvia mentioned on Left Behind Neighbourhoods, and that's IPPR research is so vital in making the link between quality of life, access to opportunities and transport. So really looking forward to hearing from Stephen. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Chris Todd, Director of Transport Action Network, to tell us about the economic benefits or otherwise of the Lower Thames Crossing and other things. Over to you, Chris.
Hello, thanks very much for inviting me along. I will try and retain the positivity of this morning, but it's sometimes difficult when you're at the coalface of campaigning. I'm just going to share my screen and take it from there, so just bear with me. start the slideshow. Okay. Yes, I'm founder and director of Transport Action Network, which I set up in 2019 to provide the sort of wider support for local campaigns and local communities, as Jonathan Bray was saying, was so important in terms of spawning change in the transport environment, excuse me. But before I start on talking about the Lower Thames Crossing, I just wanted to pay tribute to the brilliant work upon which our campaign is based on, which was done by the Thames Crossing Action Group, which was a local group which motivated thousands of people to get involved opposing the Lower Thames Crossing. And unfortunately, the person who was coordinating that and put so much energy, enthusiasm into the campaign, Laura Blake, had to step back down to, due to personal reasons. And that's the only reason really that TAN has got involved and sort of so involved in a specific campaign, because generally we support people to do the campaigns. We don't do it for them, or we don't do it to them. And I think that's an important point to make and to recognise. So my talk was about the economic benefits of the Thames Crossing. Well, it is a rather sort of poison chalice of a title in some senses, but I will go through what I think are the issues with the Lower Thames Crossing, and we can touch on the economics in the first place. For those of you who don't know, this is a map of the area. It may not be as clear as it might have been, but hopefully you can see the dark blue line with the dashed line is where is the Lower Thames Crossing. The dashed represents where it would be roughly in a tunnel. It's about 14.5 miles of smart motorway. Yes, you heard correctly, smart motorway, the motorways that are meant to be banned and no longer built, but National Highways is still doing it. It's another 6 lanes of road connectivity between the south and north of the Thames. It joins in the south the M2A2, and it comes across and joins the M25 just south of junction 29, which is the A127. On the map, you can see the existing Dartford crossing, which is 8 lanes of tarmac. So in total, when and if the Lower Thames Crossing is built, we're talking of 14 lanes of tarmac. You can see HS1 there. It's the only public transport connectivity in the whole area, but it's not really suitable. It's not geared up for local transport. So in effect, there are no real public transport connections in this area, and the nearest one west of Dartford is 9 miles away at Woolwich. So if you're looking at this, as a problem, we've got a problem with transport. What is it? It's not the fact that we've got a dearth of tarmac. It's actually we've got a dearth of public transport. So what do the boffins at National Highway or government DFT come up with? Yes, we need more tarmac, obviously. They did briefly consider this in 2009. That might be a public transport alternative, but no, it could never take all the lorries, so we won't bother. And if anyone has any doubt that the Lower Thames Crossing is going to ease congestion, it might provide a modicum of relief at Dartford. In fact, National Highways project it would last about 5 years before the crossing is still over capacity. But it's going to increase congestion and slow down journey times on the A13, the M2, the A2, and the M25, all of which will lead to more road building. And the red junction in the middle, G, Orsett-Cock Junction, that will be over capacity at day 1. So it's just going to spawn and require lots more road development. It's not going to solve the problem. This is an infographic that surprisingly has not been created by us. It was created by Stantec working for Thurrock Council, and they calculated basically that the Lower Thames Crossing fails on all of its scheme objectives, which is pretty impressive, really. And, it shows what Rachel Reeves, she's managed to pick another winner, obviously. I did promise I would talk about the economics. The total cost, we reckon, is around 13 to 16 billion pounds. When this was going through planning, it was recognised as being £9 billion, and that's what all the economics were based on. Even then, the benefit cost ratio wasn't very impressive. It was less than 1 for the basic, and then when it was adjusted with these sort of wider spurious economic benefits, it only just managed to crawl over 1. That's when the cost was £9 billion. Now the cost, even the government is saying £10 billion. It's likely it's going to be even more. It's likely that it's actually going to be costing the economy money, not creating money for the economy. Part of the reason that our cost estimate is 13 to 16 billion pounds is that National Highways took out lots of elements of the scheme that are needed to make it function. The Tilbury Port Road, for example, upgrading the Orsett-Cock Junction. The government is now talking about having to upgrade the A2, M2. All of those costs, we reckon there's probably another £4 billion worth of road building costs and other traffic management costs that will be needed to make the Lower Thames Crossing function and all the traffic networks, all the road network around it function properly. So we're looking at, oh, and the other thing that I do need to address is well, won't it be built by private finance? So it's all fine because we're not going to have to pay for it. Well, even with private finance, the government is not proposing private finance pays for all of it. It won't pay for all of those additional £4 billion worth of roads and traffic management measures, for example. The government is having to pump prime the system to get it ready for a possible private finance intervention. So the public is still going to pay £6 to £9 billion for this scheme. So what we're seeing in terms of value for money, it's low, if not poor, most likely poor. It's not the economic boost for the UK economy that Rachel Reeves is hoping for. It's more of a damp squib. And just as importantly, it's taking money from other areas, i.e. it has an opportunity cost. And an example of this is seen by the recent cancellation or stopping of the Midland mainline electrification, or Sadiq Khan complaining that he's not getting money for the DLR extension to Thamesmead. All of those are examples of why putting money into the Lower Thames Crossing is costing other areas of the country investment in the transport network. So, who does it help? Well, it doesn't help rail freight, that's for sure. This is a long distance trade route, as a similar announcement we had recently on the A66. 2 long distance rail trade routes, ideal for getting freight off of the roads, heavy lorries which involved in more deaths and injuries on the roads, and putting it onto rail and making the roads safer, easing congestion, reducing carbon emissions. But no, rail freight is actually going to suffer under this. And in fact, the recent £590 million that the government bunged at the Lower Thames Crossing to not build anything, but just get it ready for privatisation, that money, if invested in the rail network, would have almost paid for all of the changes that are needed, all the small scale changes that are needed, and the Ely Junction upgrade to deliver the transformational rail freight that is needed. And it would have removed potentially 500,000 to 1.1 million lorries off our roads every year. But no, it's gone into a road doing nothing. It's also not going to help 250,000 households without a car in Kent and Essex, very much links to the topic that IPPR have just been investigating in their latest report. 1.2 million people at high risk of transport-related social exclusion in Kent and Essex. That doesn't count the people also at high risk in East London. All of these people are not going to be helped by the Lower Thames crossing. They're still going to be left behind without good transport links. In fact, it's going to make it worse for them because there'll be no chance that those transport links will actually improve if all the money is being spent on more tarmac. The NHS won't be helped by this. This road scheme is what stands out by the fact that it's one of the few road schemes where crashes, deaths and serious injuries are actually going to increase as a result of the road being built. It's not going to help emergency services for the very same reason. It's certainly not going to turbocharge the economy that Rachel Reeves is so desperate to see. And it's going to see local residents facing 7 years of disruption for less than 5 years of traffic relief at Dartford. So overall, why is a very good question. Trying to be positive and trying to head off the government making the wrong decision, we produced this report, Essex Kent Superlinks, which is based on some research that Jonathan Roberts did for us on high capacity alternatives to a road-based crossing. It came up with a number of recommendations, but basically, if you put a permanent rail link in at Dartford, you could potentially generate 100 million passenger journeys every year. You could remove and do the rail freight upgrades as are needed. You could remove 500,000 to 1.1 million lorries off our roads every year. And you could also consider putting in a local tram connection and restoring one or both of the ferry connections, because as I say, at the moment, the only public transport connectivity other than HS1 is a very slow and tortuous bus journey between Thurrock and Bluewater. It does link into the public transport, the rail network, but it is not a serious high capacity option. Unfortunately, Heidi Alexander didn't listen to us, and so she's gone ahead and approved the scheme. But this still remains very much on the table. There is still a need, regardless of whether you build a Lower Thames crossing, for a public transport connection in this area. Because at the moment, the reality is for people living in Kent who want to get to jobs in Essex, is that if you don't drive, you've got a 45 to an hour journey into London and out again, and all the costs involved to basically travel what should be a 5 or 10 minute journey across the river. And so I think, this will not go away. But in terms of, just to sort of sum this up, this is a very, a bit of a sprint through the issues around the Lower Thames crossing. I think the question for all of us is why? Why, when we had Labour come into power last year, people were very optimistic. And in fact, the first signs were very good. But since, I think, unfortunately, Louise Haigh left or was made to leave, the tone and the emphasis of the government and its decision-making has changed quite dramatically. And the Lower Thames crossing being such an expensive white elephant was the road scheme I think everyone thought would be scrapped because the budgets were tight. It delivered such few benefits and it causes so many other problems. And I think the fact that Rachel Reeves has nailed her colours to it begs the question, why? And that's all. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. Fantastic presentation. And now delighted to introduce Kat Hobbs, who's founder and director of We Own It. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be here with you all today. It's a really interesting session, and it's so exciting to hear about the archive and all of the things that will be captured there. So I'm going to do a presentation as well. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Okay. See this?
That's looking great. Yeah, just a reminder, by the way, sorry to interrupt, Kat, before we get started, to everybody on the call, we are taking questions at the end on all the presentations and the whole session. So lots of time left for questions at the end, and we've got some coming in various chats that are being transcribed for us. So thank you for the questions so far. We'll take questions at the end. Brilliant. Thank you, Kat. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. So I started campaigning for better transport back in 2005, 2006 with the Friends of Suburban Bristol Railways and Julie Boston, who's in the middle there. And we won an extra train for the Severn Beach line, which was a very exciting introduction to campaigning. And it was off the back of that I then joined Campaign for Better Transport in 2007. And I was there for 3 years till 2010. So I remember joining in with the Sardine Man protests. I was the public transport campaigner and doing a Mystic Peg at the station to talk about the cost of walk-on fares. And I guess that, you know, all of that, the local campaigning and the national campaigning, was my introduction to what good campaigning looks like. And I know there was a question in the chat about that, which I had a thought on. And, you know, I think good campaigning is focused on winning, it's strategic, and it's also creative and fun. I think both Friends of Suburban Bristol Railways and, of course, Campaign for Better Transport, you know, ticked all of those boxes. And it was very exciting to arrive at the office near Old Street at the time, and to find Becca Lush campaigning against road building at the time, who I'm sure some of you will know or will remember, and then the rail campaigner at the time on the phone to the Department of Transport, because that's the kind of relationship that Stephen had sort of enabled. So it was a really exciting time for me, and it's really useful also to have the reminder from Jonathan Bray to keep your junk, because We Own It's junk includes a giant knife and fork, a huge head of Richard Branson, an enormous fat cat costume, and some of which were produced by a fantastic activist called Stig, who also, I just remembered this morning, produced the train and plane costumes for a video that I made while at Campaign for Better Transport, which I will try to dig out in case that's of any interest for the archive. But we had a real person in a train costume, person in a plane costume, chasing each other around Hoxton Square at one point, which was quite good fun. So I set up We Own It in 2013 to be a voice for the majority of the public who want to see services owned by the public and working for them instead of for private profit. And that is a majority across all demographics, across all political parties. All different groups of voters want to see public ownership. And our essential argument, I don't know if I'm in the way there, or if that's just my screen, is that public services are things that meet our essential needs. They're often natural monopolies, so there's not meaningful competition, and they are things that we should have some accountability over, because they are concerning issues that concern us all, like our rivers, our energy, public transport, and so on. And what we argue is that we've had 40 years of an extreme ideological experiment. It has not worked. And what we see is the same patterns again and again, whether you're thinking about water or energy, whether you're thinking about rail or buses, Royal Mail, the NHS, care work, council services. When private profit-making companies get involved, they tend to do the same things. They spend money on shareholder dividends. That's their job. They often cut corners in order to do so. They are often cherry picking, and we really see the impact of that, I think, in transport in terms of bus networks and also train networks. It creates fragmentation. Often regulation can't really keep up with what the private companies want to do. We're of course seeing that in the case of Thames Water and all of the privatised English water companies right now, which we're also campaigning on. They take flexibility and capacity out of the public sector, and they also sometimes force the public sector to bail them out. And this was us a few years ago talking about when Richard Branson wanted to be bailed out on the East Coast Line, and this was us outside King's Cross with a big red bucket collecting donations for Richard Branson's bailout. Of course, we didn't get any money, but that was a kind of creative way of drawing attention to the issue. And so over the years, it started in 2013, we've won a lot of victories. And those include pushing back against the closure of railway ticket offices, pushing obviously for the whole railway to be brought into public ownership, which is now happening with the rail franchises at least coming into public ownership. We've had victories also on the NHS, which is kind of peripheral to this, but good in terms of stopping the privatisation of NHS professionals, stopping private companies sitting on NHS boards, pushing back against private company ownership of GP surgeries. We've also won campaigns around probation and the land registry, which we helped to stop the land registry being privatised and to bring probation back into public ownership. And then perhaps most sort of relevant for the conversation now, we set up the campaign, as has been mentioned, Better Buses for Greater Manchester, and we're hugely grateful to the support of the Foundation for Integrated Transport for funding that campaigning work, which, as Stephen mentioned earlier, was very much about going out to people in Greater Manchester saying, how are you finding your buses? What do you need? And people desperately wanted public control over their buses. And obviously we won that campaign with Andy Burnham introducing public control of buses in Greater Manchester. So we had a campaigner, Pascal, who was based in Greater Manchester, working on that campaign for several years, creating a coalition with community groups, unions, environmental groups, and pushing for that policy decision to happen. So we were hugely proud of that. And as I say, really, really grateful to Foundation for Integrated Transport and also Jonathan Bray for really helpful advice around that campaigning. We then built on that in West Yorkshire, which is now also bringing buses into public control, and also in South Yorkshire. And that work has been done by Matthew Topham, who's based in Yorkshire. So we had a kind of local campaigner creating the coalition, pushing for the victories, getting press coverage, doing creative actions and getting the victories that we needed to see on buses. And what we now want to see, and as Sylvia mentioned, we've got the buses legislation now making franchising easier. We want that to be as easy as possible. And we also would like government to be making it easier for local areas to set up new publicly owned bus companies, because we have the 9 municipal bus companies that were that managed to escape Thatcher. And some of them are really impressive, like Reading Buses, for example, which invests an extra 3 million in its buses every year because it doesn't have to pay out dividends to shareholders. We want to see not just the ability for local areas to plan their own bus networks and get them right for the people in that area, but also all of the profits being reinvested back into the system to make buses better. Sort of big picture point on privatisation, there is no difference between the efficiency of private and public companies. There's a comprehensive review of that, but privatisation means that we have to pay dividends to shareholders, we have to pay more for the cost of capital, and we also have to create and regulate artificial markets, which in itself is a cost and a burden. So I wanted to briefly refer to, in terms of costs around this, these two reports, which to my knowledge haven't really been superseded. The Rebuilding Rail report, which was published over a decade now. So if anybody wants to create a new report like this, that would be incredibly useful for us. But this report points out that over £1 billion is wasted, or has been wasted, because of the privatised system on our railway. And then this report on buses, building a world-class bus system for Britain, which is again by Transport for Quality of Life, who I'm sure many of you will probably be familiar with, but if you're not, check out their website. That looked at how are the best bus systems in the world run, and it found that public control makes buses better and public ownership makes them better still, and means that around £506 million could be saved every year to be reinvested back into better services. So that's just a bit on the cost. So I'm going to move us on to campaigning before I finish, because it feels like it's good to tell you what we're campaigning on around rail. So obviously, as people probably know, or many people will know, we have rail legislation coming up in the autumn the Railways Bill. And this is about how Great British Railways is established and what happens, and some of the different aspects have been touched on already in terms of what Campaign for Better Transport is working on. So these are our demands from We Own It. So we're saying we actually need to get rid of the old 1993 competition law applying to rail, because that doesn't help us. It doesn't help to have a duty to promote competition. What we should be prioritising is society, the environment, the economy, and making those duties front and centre in how the railway is run. So we want to scrap the competition laws, and we want to stop private companies from clinging on and aggressively applying to run bits of our railway and to carry on making a profit at the expense of passengers in the wider network, and the possibility of cross-subsidy. So we want to say no to cherry picking. We also want to see Transport Focus, yes, as a voice for passengers, but actually as a democratically accountable voice. Because if you think about unions, they are a voice for workers, but passengers don't have a democratically accountable voice. And we think that would be one way of giving some real power to passengers that actually counts and makes a difference. We're also arguing that the ROSCOs, the rolling stock companies, are incredibly wasteful. They are the most profitable bit of the railway right now. And the government does not plan to actually own our trains. So in its current plans, the ROSCOs will stay privately owned, creaming profit out of the system, money that could be put back into making our system better. And why can't this country, if we can have Great British Railways, surely we can have Great British Trains? So that's what we're arguing. They should be launching Great British Trains and actually owning our trains, as well as having a publicly owned organisation running the franchises. We want one publicly owned ticket retailer for simpler and lower fares. We want a streamlined rail timetable, and we've been working with Jonathan Tyler, who also wrote a really good piece on the timetable they have in Switzerland for Transport for Quality of Life. So that, yeah, we want to see a really integrated timetable. Again, competition law doesn't help with that. We need a planned railway, and we want to see investment, just as Campaign for Better Transport does. And I'm sure people are aware of how much investing in rail is a no-brainer in terms of economic benefits. So yeah, that's the Roscoe gravy train. And I'm going to leave you with an action. We've just launched an open letter to the Transport Secretary, asking her to stop the new private rail contracts and the private companies trying to push their way back into the system. And we've launched this together with Association of British Commuters, amongst others. And if you agree with the points I've just made, you can write to your MP and ask them to join our drop-in session at Parliament in September to learn about those arguments and how they can make Great British Railways be a big success. Because from our perspective, this is the chance for public ownership to show what it can do. And if we have a messy system with private companies clinging on, trying to make a profit, and a whole big hodgepodge, it's just not going to work. But if we have an actual vision, if we have funding, if we have proper public ownership, we can get the kind of railway that passengers deserve and that works for everyone. And that will really show what can be done with the railway. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Really great to be here. And please do take action if you agree with all of that.
Thank you, Kat. Fantastic presentation. Great to hear from you and about the work that We Own It is doing. For our final presentation this morning, before we take some questions and discuss some of the questions that are coming in the chat, we are going to hear from Stephen Frost, who is Principal Research Fellow and Head of Transport Policy at the Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Michael. Really great to be invited to this event, and I feel like I've learned a lot already about both the archive and also the history of transport campaigning, which was a gap in my own knowledge. So it's been a real pleasure to be here today. No slides from me, and I'm going to try and keep this brief so we have more time for questions. The main thing I want to get across is actually kind of been said really by the other presenters today, and particularly echoes Rob's words from the start of this webinar. And in short, encouraging people to imagine what the future could look like and empowering them to create it is central to getting a transport system that works better for communities and the environment. And you see that in kind of Kat's work on democratic accountability and Chris's work in trying to stop various things that could do active harm to communities, that people stepping up and being part of transport is really essential. And this idea sits at the heart of IPPR's work as we focus on making the changes necessary in transport in response to the climate and nature crises. And we see these two things as going hand in hand, addressing transport inequality and understanding public attitudes and creating more space for people in transport decision making. The context for this, which I'm sure won't be news to people on this call, is that transport is the largest source of emissions in the UK. And it's good to reflect that part of this is due to a success story, that the pace at which the energy sector has gone green is something to be celebrated and learnt from around what is possible in climate action. But mostly transport is in the position it is now because we've done very little to bring emissions down over the last several decades, and you can find report after report kind of pointing out that lack of action and the challenges that now creates in hitting targets in 2030 and beyond. And you can point to lots of potential causes for this delay in environmental action. But for us, one of the most significant is that the changes required to how we get around can be disruptive, and decision makers fear the political consequences of asking people, particularly drivers, to change their behaviours. Especially true when times are tough and the cost of living keeps rising. Adding anything else into people's lives is seen as being kind of untenable for many. But time and time again in our own engagement with the public, which includes polling, focus groups, all the way through to citizens' juries and quite intensive engagement within communities, including both drivers and non-drivers, we have heard that effectively no one is happy with the status quo at the moment. People are increasingly aware of the harms caused by traffic to people's health, and no one is benefiting from being stuck in traffic jams in cities that are not designed for the level of cars that are currently in them. They consistently tell us that they want the future to look very different to what we have today. So for us, it is less about asking people to change in a way that they don't want to, and more about finding a way to deliver the improvements people say they want in a way that is fair, effective, and ideally, given the urgency of the climate crisis and the scale of public health impacts of our current system, quite quick change wherever possible. And IPPR's work over the last few years argues that achieving this using existing approaches to decision making is highly unlikely to be successful. Without changing the wiring of transport appraisal and who is in the room making decisions, you're likely to get the same outcomes or settle for incremental changes that barely shift the dial on our current car-centric system. And our research points to some of the answers to this, which is around giving people more power and voice in decision making to drive that change. And this can be seen in kind of local campaigns, in the design and delivery of neighbourhood schemes, or new bus routes and kind of how services work for different people, and could be used nationally in considering new approaches to motoring taxation and addressing the issues caused by fuel duty remaining frozen for years whilst the cost of trains keeps rising. So some may be aware, as it's been mentioned a few times on this call, I'm grateful for the shout outs, that we released a report yesterday on the transport challenges of low income households. And this addresses many of the themes that I've mentioned, and you can find lots of very wise words in it from some of my colleagues as well. In it, we describe how the lack of decent transport options contributes to social exclusion in the UK and makes it harder for people to access the things they need, or indeed afford other essentials in life, from heating their homes to kind of good food as well. And again, the causes of this are complex and they range from social norms through to history of spatial planning and indeed kind of other demographic factors. But the effects are clear. Transport disadvantage in the form of either unequal access to good public transport options or forced car dependence. And these lead to limited opportunities to increase people's income through employment, education and training, increased barriers to accessing community life and kind of social capital that can come from that, and barriers to accessing healthcare as well. Leads to higher household costs, financial insecurity, Increased exposure to transport-related harms. It causes stress, anxiety, and time pressures in people's lives, and that is one of the most common themes that we hear in any of the focus groups and public engagement that we have, is that people just don't enjoy the current process of getting around in many of their daily journeys. And finally, it leads to reduced engagement in decision making and political processes. And this, we argue, is kind of part responsible for the lack of urgency in shifting from the status quo in transport. If those most negatively impacted by the current transport system experiencing all of the things that I've just listed because they do not have access to good transport options had a voice in decision making, then more transformative change would be considered both necessary and possible. And you would also see more of our kind of national funding going towards the kind of things that make the most difference in people's lives, and not large-scale infrastructure projects which really won't. As part of our research, we have convened citizens panels in various parts of the country, from Hastings to South Wales, Liverpool and Aberdeenshire and Thurrock. Chris mentioned them earlier. And across all of these, we hear the same desire for the future of transport. Communities that are more walkable, where kids feel safe getting around and playing independently. Reliable and frequent buses that connect people to where they need to go. And that doesn't just mean the city centre, but means kind of local destinations that really matter to them, or indeed to kind of leisure opportunities and to nature. And these being well integrated with trains that are far more affordable. Some of our research that's coming out soon will show how the cost of trains is potentially driving higher dissatisfaction in the UK for transport than indeed potholes, given the salience of potholes. That will kind of surprise me when we got our polling back. And people, in achieving all of those goals, people don't mind the idea of some inconvenience, as long as they've been involved in the process and as long as they believe the action taken is fair to those, particularly who are kind of most marginalised or disadvantaged by kind of current transport system. And at the moment, kind of if you work in transport policy, you're hearing a lot about being vision-led and people-focused. And as part of this, our core argument is we need to be clear whose vision we're working towards and which people have a say in that future. And getting this right is central to achieving a just transition towards kind of net zero, bringing down emissions from transport at pace, and creating a more inclusive transport system. And that's it from me. That's all I wanted to say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. Fantastic presentation. Now that brings us to the end of our presentation section of this morning, and towards the end of the webinar indeed, but we've got a good bit of time now to explore some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. We've had a great range of questions so far. I'm going to read some of them out, and I'll direct to various members of the panel to address some of the answers or possible answers, and see what we can explore. So first of all, we had one actually from a member of the panel himself. So from Rob Scargill, I wanted to ask if we could talk about the process of leading a campaign from start to finish. And I think I should say that Stephen Joseph has had to go to another meeting because he is still a very busy man, which is great and inspirational in itself. But I'd love to ask Jonathan Bray if you might address this question. Can you talk about the process of leading a campaign from start to finish? Because you have, of course, done that yourself in many cases.
Gosh, that's a huge question, and there are also the people who are actively involved in campaigns, which I'm not so much at the moment. But just to pick out a few things, or the way I tried to operate was, one, you need your ammunition, which is your facts and your figures, and also you need, I think, this is someone else's approach that I nicked, but it's attack, defence, policy. So what are you saying that's wrong? What are you going to be criticised for, and what's your alternative? You need those three things in place, and you need to keep hammering away at a few key themes. I think the other thing is networks. So you need academics and respectable folk who will say that you're right. You need the people on the ground. You need people in the middle who can do strategy and articulate the case to kind of pull it all together. So you're trying to work on all these multiple levels, because I think no one really, if there was a magic potion you could take that says, yeah, you do this, you'll win, we'd all be taking it. And I could be earning fantastic amounts of money. But there isn't really. I think it's about keeping going, about hitting all the buttons on all these different levels at the same time, and just keeping going. So those are a few thoughts from my time when I was of campaigning full time, but I'm sure others who are more active will also have views on what they think is effective.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, perhaps as you say, perhaps we could turn to Sylvia to respond to this question as well, because I mean I think we've mentioned the bus stop standard, which is a recent campaign which is already succeeding, but also Sylvia authored effectively the Bus Back Better work which government is now implementing, and can perhaps speak to sort of more recent successes and the life cycle, if you like, of a campaign from start to finish. We've had one ourselves as well on the London travel card, which was a medium term one in Sylvia's time and my time. So Sylvia, perhaps would you like to pick up some more recent things in the life cycle, if you like, of a campaign?
Thanks, Michael. Well, as our head or king of campaigns for better transport, obviously you know that approach very well. I think just to roll it back to basics, I think what's very important for me in a campaign is about what is the end goal, what are you trying to achieve, and then working out what are the current barriers to achieving that outcome, what are the sort of policy considerations, and what and who you need to influence in the process of achieving that change. So having a very clear theory of change, if you will. So what are the steps that need to be taken by whom in order to implement this? And then what evidence and what pressure you need to apply in order to achieve that outcome. So I guess, yes, just to give some examples, in the when Transport for London said that they would end the London travel card, which is the travel card that can be added to a rail ticket in order to have access to public transport for the whole day. It's basically an integrated multimodal ticket. We basically opposed its scrappage because of the opportunity it provides for multimodal travel, but also in terms of the cost addition that it would present for families, for groups, people traveling outside of London into London. So we identified the decision makers involved in this. We proposed a workable solution and how those additional costs need to be shared between the decision makers and actors. We provided that evidence. We involved local authorities and leaders in the areas for the people that would be affected by that change. And we also involved our individual supporters to write to those decision makers to implement a change. And importantly, having that inside relationship with all those decision makers, we were able to individually reach out and broker, if you will, that solution. So as Jonathan said, it's important to have the good relationships with those decision makers, but also support along the way from people on the ground and decision makers in the middle.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, it's a great case study of a really successful medium-term campaign. Can I bring in Chris Todd? Chris.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a couple of small points, but I mean, relating to what Jonathan was saying earlier, you need passion and you need stamina to run a campaign. If you don't have that passion, then you don't really have the drive to continue and to last the course. And I know with many of the local groups that we've been supporting who are fighting a dual carriageway in a country park, for example, in Rimrose in Liverpool, 7 years they had to battle that. Stonehenge has been another very, very long campaign, which would not have, succeeded if people weren't passionate and committed to those. But I think I just wanted to draw on some of the inspiration we've heard about today. Another aspect of campaigning that is very important is humour. And we heard it from Kat and we've heard it from others. If you bring humour into it, it just takes the message across in a way that cuts through the facts and figures never will.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you make that point, Chris. or those points indeed. Determination, passion, and humour is so effective, as Kat's highlighted, as the video highlights. And again, I mean, I won't stop banging on about it, but this video that Kate and the NRM have done is so good, and it's very serious. And there's that balance between humour and actually getting on with the serious business of campaigning and enabling change. But it has an impact, and it's had an impact. And let's make sure we keep that involved in all the work we do. Next question was from Abby Wilson, and the question was asking, what would we rank as some of the biggest successes and failures, indeed, which is fair to ask, of us, so Transport 2000 and Campaign for Better Transport over the years. And Stephen Joseph, who's had to leave it, has answered that on some fronts. Stephen has said that he would put stopping some of the plans in the Serpel report. This is for further rail cuts that came after Beeching from going ahead. And I think that's a really good point. I bang on about that all the time, especially in the current context of the fact that we've turned the corner. Rail lines are reopening now. That just wasn't the case. It's always worth remembering. So that was a big success in our early days. Also, company cars, so changing the company car provision for business workers, and we're still doing work on business engagement for public transport, indeed, including on the Channel Tunnel. But that counted as a success in those days. In terms of things that Stephen Joseph would have liked to had more impact on, and this speaks to a question that someone else has put about coaches. Actually trying to get the DfT to take coaches seriously is something which Stephen felt that he wasn't able to achieve in his time necessarily. And also getting government reform of the transport appraisal process, which still favours road over rail. And I mean, they say that these days there is a look being had at the Green Book, which is linked to that appraisal process, the Treasury's Green Book. But yeah, I agree with Chris's head shake on that one. There's not necessarily cause for huge optimism on that. So the appraisal process needs significant shifting, even when, I mean, you look at business cases, BCR of low Thames crossing is absolutely hopeless. BCR of proposed public transport links, by contrast, is phenomenal, and that's ignored because the appraisal process is so messed up still. So yeah, thank you for those responses, Stephen Joseph, in your absence. I'd add to some of that actually, and Sylvia's alluded to our travel card campaign, which I'm always keen to emphasise is not the London travel card, but the travel card for people getting in and out of London. Huge success. £2 bus fare cap, actually. That's a recent success in our recent time. That's had a huge impact, a measurable impact on people's ability to take the bus on a landscape or in a landscape where bus services have been dismantled, especially in the last few years. Having that £2 cap has helped a huge number of people, and we've got the data to show that. So I count that as a really significant success of ours in recent years. Right, so moving on to another question. We have had one on sorry, I'm just glancing my notes here with the chat because the questions are coming in still, which is great. Yes, we had this question on coach. I don't know if got a few questions on coach. I don't know if Sylvia would like to elaborate on the coach challenge that we face. Now, Confederation of Passenger Transport are the organisation, the member body for bus and coach. So they really are the voice for that. But in the current landscape, I don't know if Sylvia, you'd be able to address the challenge that we have in getting coach to be appreciated by Department for Transport.
Yes, and as I said, we cover all modes. So coach is basically an important part of the local and intercity transport mix. We have been big proponents of including that as a range of option within the Integrated National Transport Strategy. So we do make the case for that. We don't do as much focused policy interventions on coaches because it's a sort of fully separate policy landscape, if you will, than it is for local buses. So as you mentioned, CPT do lead on policy for coaches, but when we work with local authorities, we basically argue for the most appropriate mix of transport options that are suitable for that specific locations. And yes, coaches do have an important role to play, so we do bring that into the mix when we're talking about local transport improvements.
Thank you. We've had a question from Douglas Butler on schematic rail maps and the challenge that people may have in looking for railway stations. You often have BR, there's a case for schematic rail maps. I wonder if that's one that Kat might pick up on rail reform and something about simplification for the user, because you've talked about the ticketing platform as well. Is there a role here for schematic rail maps to improve that situation for the public?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, to me, it makes me think there are lots of people in this country who know an awful lot about the railway and how it should be run, and what, you know, either from a more kind of, you know, rail expert perspective where people have a lot of knowledge, or from just a user perspective where they're a passenger and they know what is easy for them, what is important to them. And, you know, how are we involving those people in the new Great British Railways? And this is why we're saying, you know, in terms of transport focus, if we want to have a really effective passenger voice, we need that to be a really strong passenger voice, and that means people should be able to vote for their representatives. People should have some power. People should be able to get involved in meetings and in processes, suggest ideas, come up with new initiatives, and suggest things about things like schematic rail maps, where they have that kind of either expertise or passenger perspective.
Thanks very much, Kat. That's great. Now we've had one on trams, and conscious I know that we are working more on tram than we have in the past. Question about when we've got heavy rail and buses, whether there's a need for trams. And we've got intercity rail, regional commuter rail, and from the mid-2030s high-speed rail. Do we need light rail and very light rail to complicate the public transport journey? I'd say a word on that, and I might then pass over to Jonathan Bray, and Kat's highlighted a great report that UTD did on light rail a little while back, which is a great report. And Jonathan is a tram expert as well. I just the short piece I would say in response to that one is that I mean, I'm a sort of long game person. I'm really passionate about our history, but also the history of the society we live in, and the fact that we're doing work on trams speaks to the fact that 100 years ago, towns and cities around the country, including coastal communities, had frequent electric public transport that met their needs, and they now don't. And I don't believe that's right. I don't believe it's fair. I think you know, we're seeing the kind of impact of that now in the work that Stephen does with IPPR. Sylvia's highlighted work we've been doing in Hull, which used to have a fantastic tram network. And if you've been to Hull recently, the streetscape landscaping they've done makes it even more obvious where those tram lines went, and you see them across the world, across Europe, places like Nantes and Bordeaux, similar coastal communities where they have public transport they deserve. And I believe really passionately in the work we're doing on trams, because I think it's just such a direct connection to TRSE, transport-related social exclusion and inequality in this country. So I think it's vital we're doing that work. I do see the argument and the barrier that we've had in this country, which is that it's been too expensive and too complicated. That could be linked, if you like, to HS2. You know, we've not been great at large-scale infrastructure. We've not been great at medium-level infrastructure, but that's why we need to do the work we're doing. So I would say that that tram provides a really important intermediary, and the challenge we have in the UK is getting beyond the kind of mental blocker on that. And of course, it's not always the right mode in every area, but it's, as you can see in places like Manchester, Nottingham, when it's done, it really works. So that's my slightly short piece that got longer than it might have been on trams. But I'd love to pass over to Jonathan to supplement that. Really, you know, why do we need trams when we've got other modes, and indeed VLR? And there is a point there, by the way, that was raised by the question on VLR. Very valid point about reinventing the wheel. VLR technology, that's very light rail, for those who don't know, is a shallow track form which can reduce the cost of and speed of building trams without the need to move utilities, which is very exciting. So that's very exciting. But at the same time, the good point in that question is we don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. And some of the work we're trying to do is create a consistent pipeline and model so that we can roll out tram networks in more places that deserve them, as I said at the start. But Jonathan, perhaps you'd like to supplement that.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to circle around back to campaigning and the theme of this event, because and what Kat was saying as well, what I've tended to find in campaigns is not only do you have to stop people from doing something stupid, but you also have to set out a vision of what should happen instead, because the people who are paid to do that often don't bother. And I think the rail nationalisation is an example of this. That I'm just flabbergasted by the lack of any meaningful debate about what a national rail should do and be. It's all very closed about how the railway is going to organise itself. How can we do it as slowly as possible? How can we do it without upsetting anybody? How we can keep as many elements of what went before? How can we keep rail in this kind of no man's land? Whereas to me, if you're going to do it, and then look at what you could do with that. I mean, where's the debate about bringing back a national intercity network? Where's the debate about what the fares offer should be? Where's the debate about what the governance of a nationalised, publicly owned rail system should be? It's not there. And I think that's because the professional and managerial class are in charge of the debate, and they're motivated by not disagreeing with each other too much and keeping the show on the road. And they really haven't mentally made the transition to this new setup. And in the absence of the professional managerial class doing it, it's often down to campaigns to set out a vision, which Kat has been doing. But where is this bigger debate? It's very disappointing, and a particularly acute example of what I was talking about. And I think on light rail was a kind of mini example of that. Because the light rail industry is making the case for light rail, fair enough. But who is it that's saying, why is it costing so much in the UK? Who is saying, how can we get the cost down to make it more like the French? Because the French build their trams at roughly twice the speed, roughly half the cost, and roughly twice as beautiful. And there has to be a reason for this. And it's organisations like Create Streets and like Campaign for Better Transport that have been bringing this to the fore. It's not the DFT, and it's not other members of the professional managerial class, wherever they happen to sit, because they all got paid, even if it costs twice as much. So it's that role which adds to the kind of exhaustion of it, or can do, because another thing, what I found is sometimes you also have to kind of try and work out what the opposition are actually saying, because they're pursuing the status quo. So it's just what we do. So you almost have to work out what their arguments are, because before you can counter them, and then you've got to set out a vision. So you've got to do it all without the resources, but nevertheless it needs doing, and we need people to continue to do that. But I think one of the things that also can happen if people are not careful, particularly those who are working for kind of more at the voluntary NGO end, is you do get burnout because it's so hard. So it's about sustaining people for the extent to which they're able to do this kind of work. And I think that's where those kind of supportive networks come in.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's a question which is for Kat. I think it relates to a figure that we use as well, actually, but it'd be great if Kat wants to take this one, which asks from, the name is GH, how do you reach the £2.50 benefit figure for every pound invested in rail, and can you provide a link to the evidence? We use that figure as well, so but Kat, if you'd like to answer that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't think I've got too much to add to that. I can find the link and put it in the chat, but it's a very well resourced and well documented figure, I think. I wonder, Michael, if I could come back on the open access question though. Would that be, or should we be later?
Yeah. If you like, while we're there, why not? So there's a question, because not people in the on the webinar can't see the questions we're having passed on necessarily. So I'll read it out. Yes, someone asks a question, says, Kat, I agree with almost all of your 7 demands, but I'm concerned about your opposition to open access. Grand Central's opened up both journeys to London and some local connectivity in Yorkshire and between the Durham coast and Yorkshire. Fares are lower and more flexible. NER's new fares pilot, so-called, it's not really a pilot, it's true, is awful. Hull trains have expanded, Hull to London from 1 LNER train to about 8. So feel free, please, Kat, to address the open access question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of sides to this. So one side is kind of building on what Jonathan just said about the vision for this publicly owned railway and what we're trying to achieve here. And I think, you know, if what we want to do is open up new areas of the country for new rail lines or new markets, new people to take the train, and we want more people to take the train and we want passengers to get more involved, there's a range of ways that we can do that without relying on a tiny little bit of competition around the margins, where kind of by definition the private companies are cherry picking and trying to get involved where they can make a profit. So we would argue at We Own It, you know, let's have an actual vision for the railway. Let's have Swiss levels of investment. Let's have a passenger body to push for expansion of the railway and for passengers to get a good service. And let's also have, you know, public ownership can involve commercially minded managers, and Christian Woolmar talks about this. So he talks about how in France and Germany you've got managers in the railway who are thinking about, how do we expand this service, how do we make it better for passengers? You know, they're being savvy. They don't have to be, you know, it's not about having somebody in the DFT making all the decisions. It's having managers on the ground who are thinking, how do we expand this, how do we be ambitious? And I think that should be our starting point for the whole thing. The other side of it is, you know, we are talking about cherry picking here. So these open access companies, they're not paying for depot space, they're not paying to train their staff, they're not paying for long-term maintenance and support costs. And so the Department for Transport estimates that they're taking 229 million a year. They want to take 229 million a year revenue out. And so what they're effectively doing is taking out money that could be used to provide more routes and more services. So it's the same argument that we use when we're thinking about bus networks and cross-subsidy. What you want to be able to do is, where you've got profitable bus routes, you want to be able to use that money, use those profits to pay for services that are needed for socially necessary services in more rural areas. You can't do that if you just have a free-for-all. You can do that if you plan a network to deliver for passengers.
Thank you. I should, for what's the word, transparency's sake, I should you know, be clear that we, I guess CBT and we have slightly different positions at the moment on rail reform, if you like to say. It's worth being open about that. We're a little more agnostic, if that's fair to say. But wondering, we sort of have the position that we were founded just after Beeching, and Beeching was in the British Rail era, and we're a little bit more. You know, there's a lot of potential responsibility placed on a government to prioritise public transport if they have full control over everything. But without getting sort of deep into that, because it's a really live and interesting conversation that I really want to sort of talk about more. As Jonathan rightly said, where are those conversations? You know, it's such a huge moment, such a huge process. I'm really keen that we should have those conversations and work together on them. There was a related question that perhaps Sylvia, I think, wanted to pick up in relation to open access. Now, there's lots of conversations about open access. European countries are going more towards open access than the UK, which is going in a different direction. But in between those two, of course, is the Channel Tunnel, where you've got a situation which we've identified where only 50% of the Channel Tunnel is being used currently. Eurostar, the default monopoly operator, it's a private line on the UK side, HS1. They, in a sense, the fares have gone up significantly, as many will know who try to travel internationally by rail. During the period of time that Eurostar has been the only operator, there's now applications going in for access to Temple Mills Depot from a few new potential entrants to share depot space with Eurostar. And there's a case for there to be more depots, and in short, for there to be more trains running on that tunnel. I mean, the point's been made very well by Gareth Dennis. You know that at the moment there's a case for competition on the Channel Tunnel, but if Eurostar were to use the whole lot, similar to domestic rail, GBR were to use the whole lot, then fantastic. It doesn't really matter who uses it so long as there are trains in the first instance. I wonder if Sylvia could pick up that point about HS1 and competition for the Channel Tunnel initially, Sylvia, if you may.
Yes, so I guess the thing to explain is that in domestic rail and international rail operate very differently, whereas on domestic open access or private operators are very much the minority. There's a need to seek permission from the government to operate those additional services to bring additional value to passengers. On international rail, it's effectively all private, it's all open access, if you will. So both the infrastructure owned privately by private companies, and also it's the private operators that deliver the services. And we only have Eurostar at the moment, but there are new operators applying or looking to enter the market for international rail. The case we're making to government is that even though it's privately operated, the government does have a role in facilitating and enabling operators to enter the market, and we see competition and also growing destinations as a big benefit to passengers and potential passengers, opening up new destinations, bringing in sort of more competitive fares as well. And we do see other countries leading the way in there. Spain, Italy, France are bringing in that balance of national and privately owned operators as well. We're seeing within the EU countries collaborating to expand cross-border international rail as well. So this is really where we want to see the UK leading in this space as well, and joining up with expanding services across the between the UK and continental Europe.
Thanks, Sylvia. And this question for Stephen Frost. From Abby Wilson, how is the IPPR identifying and reaching those people and communities that are facing transport marginalisation and inequality?
It's a really good question, and one that I wish many more people asked themselves. And I know that kind of some on the call have experience of working with different groups as well. In particular, Sylvia releasing a report recently on working with those social care workers by partnering with unions and others to reach the people where they are. And that's exactly how we do it. So we recognise that there are those with far greater ability to reach into communities or reach different groups than we can ever have as kind of researchers. And as an example, for the most recent research looking at the experience of people on low incomes of transport in the UK, we partnered with Single Parents' Rights, with Save the Children and Poverty Alliance to engage kind of groups through them and to reach their members either with surveys or directly in workshops and kind of panels and other things. And those routes for us feel like the most cost-effective, easiest way in. And it also means that those partners can advise us on the best way of framing some of these questions and making sure that we're making that opportunity to be involved in transport policy, which can be complex, opaque, frustrating, is as accessible as possible, and that we're being really clear on what groups are going to get out of their participation, which brings me to kind of three other like really practical bits on it. One, we pay everyone for taking part, making it much more accessible to a wider range of people. We're really flexible with providing support to different people, offering devices if they don't have access to kind of coming online to this. We can provide them with phones or provide them with tablets to engage with us, and we're really flexible in providing support to people who may not be familiar with Zoom and YouTube live links and all of that other stuff for taking part. And where we're doing kind of more standard focus groups and things like that, we work with professional recruiters who go out into communities to where people are. They go and stand at bus stops, they go and stand at the local high street, they try and find people wherever they are to get them involved and engaged in sharing their stories, and us using that in our research. So a big emphasis, I think, on recognising transport professionals probably not the best place to engage into all of the communities we may want to speak to, so work with others, I think, is the simple answer.
That's fantastic, Stephen. And I'd love to finish on that note, because it's so inspiring to hear how IPPR does its work and the collaborative approach and the many access points that we have. And actually I'd love to kind of keep the focus at the end on the impact on people's lives. There's just a question I will mention. We won't answer it in detail now, but it cuts to the sort of core of what the campaign that we will do. Someone asked, they said, I live in a wealthy area. It's really frustrating how the council keeps investing more and more on roads while it takes 5 times as long to travel by public transport. What to do? Voters vote for roads here. That to me is a huge question and a huge can of socio-political worms that we perhaps should open up in another session, because it's about everything really, and it cuts to the core of what we're doing, but also relates to what Stephen's work addresses, and transport-related social exclusion, and the stuff I mentioned about the context that we live in. People who used to have public transport networks don't anymore, whether it's bus networks or tram or rail, they've lost them. So it's all about getting them back so that people have better quality of life, and therefore some of those political questions will hopefully retreat into the background in due course. That's what we're all here for. Look, folks, thank you so much. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our brilliant panel of speakers. I hope the audience has found it inspirational. I hope you've enjoyed the insight into our archives. Once again, it's a great pleasure and honour for us at CBT to have Kate and Rob at the team at National Railway Museum working with this archive. We're absolutely thrilled that it's going to be featuring in the Futures Gallery and that this inspiration will continue in perpetuity. I would really urge interested transport professionals and researchers, of whom there are undoubtedly many on this call, to use that archive. So you can go to the museum and research it. You can get files out in due course. It's all being catalogued. As Rob talked about at the start, the redevelopment of the museum itself is extraordinarily exciting, and the whole area around it. Indeed, York Central project around the museum is also going to be one of the most sustainable and exciting housing developments in the country. So it's really worth a trip to York on any occasion. The railway station itself, of course, is a masterpiece. So spend as much time as you can at the NRM looking at our archive in particular and other things too. So if you've enjoyed this session, you'd like to stay in touch and find out more about it, please feel free to write to us and write to the NRM to send us your feedback and let us know how you've enjoyed the session. A huge thanks to those behind the scenes who've been working on this. So Brogan McPherson and Eugenia Agiel-Bernard, who've been working on this symposium behind the scenes. Huge thanks to our speakers today, Stephen Joseph, Jonathan Bray, Kat Hobbs, Chris Todd, Sylvia Barrett, Stephen Frost, and most of all, thanks to the team, as I've mentioned already, at the NRM, Kate Bookman, Alison Kay and Rob Scargill, for all the work you're doing with our archives. It's been a great session, and thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again at future events. Bye for now.